Hi everyone. I think I might hold this actually. Hello everyone. It's really nice to talk to you at this point of your year because you've all just finished, practically everybody in the room has just finished a live project. So we're taking this opportunity to talk about live projects within a wider context of what we call live learning and resilience. And it's part of an ongoing project that Leo and I are both working on, which features the Live Project Handbook, the Feedback Handbook, talking about students' experiences at the school, and it's all about teasing out the impact that live projects and live learning actually has on students' capacity to understand the context that they're working in and understand the relevance of what they're learning beyond the School of Architecture and out into what we call the real world. So we've put this presentation together as part of that ongoing exploration. It touches on a paper that we are going to have published within the first Architecture Educators Journal, which is called Charette, which is coming out next year. So it pulls material from that, but we're also thinking that actually we're making sort of new connections here that haven't necessarily been done before, which is about resilience and live learning, and we're very interested in pulling this out and making it and expanding it and making it into another paper. So that exploration goes on, and we're very interested in sort of constantly feeding this back to you as students who are engaged in live projects and getting your response. How do I change the? How do I change it? That one. What am I supposed to be pointing at? Where? A light is flashing, nothing's happening. Done it. Okay, so just to sort of recap on live projects. We've been running live projects at the school since 1999. And this year we did another 12, so now the total is up to 144 live projects. So there's a huge amount of people involved in this way of learning at the School of Architecture. 1,340 students, but of course that doesn't capture the many hundreds of people who have actually been involved in live projects externally, the client organisations that the students have worked with. And they are ranged in location, both very locally but also very distant. So we've had a large number of live projects actually located in Sheffield, but then we've done many more within the sort of wider region of northern England. But then we've, as you know, done one in Zanzibar, and we've done one in Dakar and Romania and Paris and many others. So this gives us an opportunity to really understand, as we sort of look back and reflect on this work that's been done, what does actually happen in terms of learning with real clients, dealing with real problems in real term. If we call that live learning, what is the nature of that learning? And specifically for the purposes of today and thinking of this sort of larger theme that we're all very much engaged in, how does live learning actually build resilience? And we're thinking about this as a learning community. It's made up of students, it's made up of people who join the students, who are sort of communities in their own right. So there may be communities of interest, communities of place, communities who come together through a certain sort of practice perhaps. We're talking about the organisations we're working with. We're thinking about the wider profession that we engage with, sometimes through live projects, but certainly as a sort of legacy of live projects as students leave the school. And then thinking about the sort of impact on society at large. And all of that put together, we're thinking about a as a community of learning. Pressing the wrong button again. And so we've got a definition of resilient communities that we think we can reflect upon in terms of live learning. We've got this definition from Studio 7. It was a definition that the students put together last year in their studio. And I'm going to come back to this, so that's just up there as something that we've used as a definition to reflect on in terms of live projects and in terms of live learning. So go back to that question. If we're talking about live learning, if we're talking about learning that goes outside the institution of the university and engages people in the wider community, what actually is the nature of that live learning? And how does it build skills to create resilient students and resilient communities? And we're starting to think about this in terms of who's doing the learning and who's doing the teaching. What are the frameworks for that learning? They're fairly established within the university, but they're not necessarily established within the community. So do we need to understand those frameworks and build wider frameworks for learning? What happens if students actually engage with clients locally, so they can have a very intimate relationship and perhaps be even in residence with those clients in that community group? What's the nature of that learning? And if those students are actually working with clients who are, for instance, located in Zanzibar, what's the nature of that learning? Is that just as valuable, or does that also have value? So just to highlight a couple of examples, we've got two projects to sort of just show you. And one is very local, and one was very distant. So the first one was Praise Pods of 2010. This is working with a very progressive primary school called Arbourthorne, not that far from here, in Sheffield. And this was very much students in residence with the learning community of the school. So they worked with the children, they worked with the school at large, the parents, the teachers, the governors. They worked with the community outside the school gates. And they kept going back. They were there doing workshops, activities, lots and lots of different forms of engagement. They were working within the curriculum at times, which is actually quite difficult to achieve. And they were very explicit about their collective learning because they were engaged with a learning community who had their own established frameworks. Pankachumvi was very different. They were actually located, well, the client base was located in Zanzibar. The students were located in the studio in Sheffield. And they got to meet their clients a couple of times, I think, maybe 2 or 3 times through the course of the live project. The clients were sometimes in London and they'd go down to travel to meet them. But the majority of that project was remote working. They did have regular contact with the clients, but they didn't have the wider contact with the community in Zanzibar that they were designing on behalf of. But there was still a collective learning going on that we believe helps the resilience to build in that distant community of Zanzibar. So I'll pass over to Leo now. This is Leo going to be talking about how we're starting to understand that there's a particular theoretical background to the pedagogy involved in live learning. And we feel that being really explicit about this background, these constructs, will actually help us understand how students in this wider community can be resilient together.
Thanks, Carolyn. At this point, we should recognise the support that we've got from Rosie Parnell in putting this together. We've been talking about live projects, the learning that's involved in live projects and the pedagogy that's associated with that for some time now. But it's been really important for Carolyn and I to be able to really set this in a wider framework. I hope to explain that a little bit now. Oops. Too far. Okay.
It's a tricky one. It is that one.
Just go back.
Is it going forward?
Yeah. Sorry about that. No?
Try the top one. They seem to alternate.
There we go.
There we go.
Right. Let's see one sort of place. So this is David Cobb's cycle of learning, which has been around for some time, as you can tell, since 1984. And what Cole was really interested in was the importance of experiential learning. and how this influences the way that people learn and experience learning. So at the top of experience, and that's something that throughout live projects that I hope that you've all had some really interesting experiences that you identify with and understand. But in order to sort of fulfill this virtuous loop of learning, it's also important that experience is backed up, and that you then reflect on the observations of that experience, and then taking that forward, begin to conceptualise that experience and understand what that has actually meant in order that you can take that forward, and then taking that forward, using that to actively experiment and try new things, take what you've learned from that first experience through, and then apply that learning on those new ideas again in further experiences. And again, so it's something that is really important to the way that we learn on an everyday basis, but particularly important for live projects. Not very much nothing.
Should we move here?
Yes, that was all. Good morning. Thank you. So, an example of that experiential learning then through live projects is the reflective review, and also the ongoing feedback and reflections that take place throughout the live project. So, going through that experience, reflecting on that, understanding what you've got from that, being able to then think about how it might influence your further actions and change the way that you approach things. Okay, so another sort of type of pedagogy that we're interested in that feeds into kind of live learning is that of critical pedagogy, which is really concerned or interested in taking the sort of understood or traditional way of learning, if you like, which is kind of this situation. So you have a speaker who apparently has knowledge, I'll let you judge that, and an audience, people, a group, a class that is listening to that and then taking in that knowledge. And really critical pedagogy is about saying, is that the way we should do things? Should we break down those barriers? Should we start to rethink the way that we are learning and do that and explore different ways of doing it? So this is an example at Albethorne School in the Life project that Carolyn mentioned before, which was a workshop whereby children were involved in starting to make kind of objects and start to think about what elements would create the praise pots. And as you can see from this image, it's not a classroom situation whereby we've got chairs and tables, people listening to the teacher talking. It's about experience, but it's also about breaking down some of those barriers. Left-hand side, we've got a quote from the Albethorne head teacher, who was, I think, when you read that quote, something that we've perhaps showed you before, but I think it's really important to understand what a difference the project makes to the school. So it's not just about us and the way that we would traditionally learn in a classroom situation, but also working with the groups that we come across and helping them to rethink the way that they learn. So working with a school, it's a formal learning institution, they've got specific ways of doing things, but actually the live projects in itself went into that school and actually encouraged them to rethink the way that they were teaching and learning. And that's something that's really crucial to the way that live projects work and the change that that can bring about. So it raises those kind of questions of who's teaching and who's learning. And I think that's really important for clients, for stakeholders and everybody involved in live projects, is that we like to think of it as a collective learning experience or reciprocal learning experience. So it's not just one group of people telling another how things should work or what the answers are. The next construct that we'd just like to kind of touch upon is the notion of situated learning, which is fairly straightforward really. And we've used a quote from Rosie Parnell herself, and it was actually a note for a presentation that she gave. And it very simply states what this issue is about. So learning takes place in the same context in which it is applied. And the example we've got here looks like a fairly sort of somebody sat in a library, but this was a live project at the Art House in Wakefield. And actually, the students who worked on this particular live project worked very closely with the artists and administrators that worked in this setting, and really began to understand the way that these people learned, the way these people work, through being with them, through exploring their everyday activities in detail and really understanding what they're about. And another example of this was taken from one of this year's live projects from Portland Works. And it was an issue that came up a number of times with the group, and something that we discussed, and how important it was for this group and for other groups to actually work in a community of practice. So at Portland Works, for instance, we've got creative people working in different areas and working in different disciplines, but largely, collectively, they're all different creative disciplines. And it was really important that students were actually there understanding the way that these people were working in detail, and actually then learning from that and taking that experience forward in order to make informed decisions about the proposals that they were creating. Okay, and critical pedagogy of SPECS takes the last two examples, so the situated learning and the critical pedagogy, together. And I think quite powerfully starts to talk about how people can bring about change and how people can influence and change other people's lives for the better. And that's something that really struck a chord when Carolyn and I first heard about it, and really thought that it fitted with the way that live projects are developing. And this is an image from the Pangachumbi project in Zanzibar. And really, excuse me, this is quite a good example of how, even though the students were working remotely, it wasn't necessarily situated learning. What was really important was that they were able to understand the place well enough and to be able to then make informed decisions to encourage people that lived on Zanzibar, the native communities there, were able to live more sustainably, but also that tourism there, and this project was associated with creating a more environmentally friendly tourist destination. So it was actually encouraging this particular development to be more environmentally sound, but it was also trying to influence wider tourism efforts around the island and make those more environmentally conscious, but also, in addition to that, encouraging communities, native communities that are involved or might be involved with tourism, to think about their own existence and how they might actually be able to engage with tourism in a more resilient fashion. And then sort of moving that on from learning to research, and because we understand that education, particularly at master's level, is underpinned by research and research by design, we just wanted to kind of bring in the issues of action research, which is the first quote, creating new knowledge by taking action. And I think every live project has that sort of at its core. But also participatory action research, which, as you can see from the quote there, the research questions, the research issues that are explored through that particular process are not defined by the researcher in advance of the project, but they're actually, the research questions are developed with the community of practice that the researcher is working with. So the researcher is very much embedded with that group, and through understanding and through participation is able to then generate a series of research questions which are then answered and developed. And quite a good example of this in live projects was the care homes live projects from last year, where they had quite a difficult group of people to engage with, those elderly people who often had dementia or other degenerative diseases, which meant that engaging with them was quite a challenge. Yet by creating really kind of clever tools, and this one being a kind of game, it was an opportunity to really understand this group of people more. So before research questions were actually developed, they're able to do this in a participative manner in order to generate those.
we're saying here is there are some pretty well-established frameworks for learning that we can apply and understand live projects in the context of. But these frameworks aren't necessarily communicated, sometimes to the students involved, but actually beyond that to the wider communities of learning. And we're really interested in where this might go, actually, if we can take this seriously and perhaps think about a client handbook for live projects, which is all about the sort of frameworks for learning that are there, that they could take the opportunity to sort of really engage with. So going back to that definition of resilient communities, thinking about the communities of learning that we've just described, we've sort of highlighted there the aspects of the definition that we really think that live projects and live learning actually help to build, where it's about valuing people, it's about taking active participation together, it's about making and valuing connections. And specifically we're talking about encouraging learning through and with experimentation. And it's very important that the change that comes about through that learning is actually managed through feedback. It's going back to that original loop that Leo was describing. Just to talk a little bit, just a second, about resilient students. And this is Rebecca Hinckley talking about the impact that live projects has had on her work as she's moved into practice. Talking about, again, the need for constant feedback and creative sessions with people. And then talking about the resilient profession that we think that live learning is actually going towards building. And it really ties into the RIBA's Future of Architects Building Futures report, where they really did talk about this way of working with communities as incredibly important for future practice. I think that's it. That is it. Thank you very much.